History has already run this experiment. The results are catastrophic, and the nation it happened to was once the most powerful civilization on Earth.
This is the story of the Spanish Empire, a civilization that didn't just win the lottery, they found the entire bank, and then they lost everything. In the 16th century, Spain became the undisputed master of the world. They had the most feared army on the planet, the mightiest fleet ever built, and an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territory. They were untouchable, they were invincible, and they were about to learn the hardest economic lesson in all of human history, that gold is not wealth, gold is a drug, and Spain was about to overdose.
To understand how this happened, we need to travel to a freezing, barren plateau high in the Andes Mountains of what is now Bolivia. The year is 1545. A local indigenous man named Diego Gualpa was chasing a llama when he stumbled and grabbed a bush to catch his fall. When the roots tore away from the earth, he saw something that would change the world forever. Shimmering veins of pure silver buried inside the mountain. He had discovered the Cerro Rico, the rich hill. And it wasn't just a mine. The entire mountain was essentially made of solid silver ore.
When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they couldn't believe their eyes. This was the El Dorado they had been dreaming of. Within decades, the remote wasteland around that mountain transformed into one of the largest cities on Earth, with a population bigger than London or Paris, all perched at 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air was so thin that men gasped just walking down the street.
But extracting that silver required labor. Enormous, brutal, relentless labor. The Spanish instituted the mita system, a forced draft of indigenous workers. Tens of thousands of men were swallowed by dark, suffocating tunnels, working week-long shifts without ever seeing sunlight, hauling heavy sacks of ore up crumbling wooden ladders. The mountain became known locally as the mountain that eats men. It was said that if you squeezed a Spanish silver coin hard enough, blood would drip out. To process the low-grade ore, the Spanish used the mercury amalgamation technique, crushing rock, mixing it with toxic liquid mercury, and forcing men to trample it barefoot. It was a chemical revolution that allowed silver extraction on an industrial scale the world had never witnessed. Between 1550 and 1800, Mexico and Peru produced roughly 80% of all the silver on Earth, and the vast majority of it sailed directly into Spain.
They minted it into the most famous coin in history, the piece of 8, the first true global currency, accepted in markets from Shanghai to Seville, from Boston to Bombay. Twice a year, massive treasure fleets gathered in Havana and sailed for Spain, riding dangerously low in the water under the weight of billions in today's money. When those ships appeared on the horizon, church bells rang across the country. The king exhaled, the bankers smiled. The party could last another year. Spain became the superpower of Europe overnight. They built soaring cathedrals dripping with gold leaf. Their military was undefeated. Their kings, first Charles V and then his son Philip II, genuinely believed God had chosen Spain to rule the world.
But here is where the fatal mistake began. They looked at their mountains of silver and said, "We are rich." They never stopped to ask whether they were actually creating wealth or just accumulating money, because those two things are not the same. Money is simply a medium of exchange. Real wealth is the ability to produce food, tools, ships, clothing, innovation. Spain had found infinite money, but they were quietly, invisibly, catastrophically stopping the production of real wealth. Picture yourself as a shoemaker in Seville in 1550. The treasure ships arrive. Sailors flood the docks with silver bursting from their pockets. Everyone wants your shoes, so naturally you raise your prices. Now imagine every merchant, baker, landlord, and craftsman in the country doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Prices in Spain exploded by 400%. In an era when prices had been essentially flat for over a century, this was civilization shaking.
The poor were crushed. Wages never kept up. Spanish peasants found themselves able to buy less food than their grandfathers could, even though the country had never had more money. Starvation crept back into the countryside, not because there was no food, but because the money itself had been broken.
And the inflation created a second, equally devastating problem. Spanish goods became too expensive to compete with anyone else. That same shoemaker now needed 10 silver coins for a pair of shoes. A French shoemaker, untouched by the silver flood, could sell the same pair for 2. So Spanish consumers stopped buying Spanish products and started importing everything from France, England, and the Netherlands. Spain had become a funnel. This poisoned the culture deeply. In England and the Netherlands, a thriving merchant class was rising, building factories and shipyards to sell goods to wealthy Spanish buyers. But inside Spain, working with your hands became something to be ashamed of. The ideal Spaniard was the hidalgo, a minor noble who owned land, refused manual labor, and lived off government pensions. Easy money had created a society of consumers and bureaucrats. The dream was to find a comfortable position near the silver tap, not to build something from scratch. Spanish literature from this era is filled with these characters, men slowly starving to death but too proud to work, polishing their armor while their bellies growled. While the Dutch were inventing the stock market and the English were revolutionizing agriculture, Spain was building churches and buying velvet capes. The empire looked magnificent on the outside. Inside, it was completely hollow. Then came Philip II's wars, and wars are extraordinarily expensive. Philip fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, battled France across Italy, and launched his most catastrophic obsession, an 80-year war to crush a Dutch rebellion in the Netherlands. To keep 70,000 soldiers fed and armed thousands of miles from home, Spain was spending fortunes it didn't have. And because domestic industry had been gutted by inflation, Spain couldn't even manufacture its own weapons. They had to buy cannons and gunpowder from foreign merchants, sometimes from the very Dutch they were trying to defeat. The silver from the Andes was literally funding Spain's enemies. Then came the Armada. In 1588, Philip assembled the greatest naval force in human history, 130 ships, 30,000 men, thousands of cannons. But he didn't pay for it with silver he had. He paid for it with silver he hoped to receive. He borrowed from powerful German and Genoese banking families at interest rates as high as 40%. When the Armada was obliterated by storms off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, half the fleet sank to the ocean floor. The debt didn't sink with it. The interest kept compounding. By the 1570s, Spain's annual interest payments alone exceeded the entire tax revenue of the empire. Every coin collected, every ounce of silver unloaded from every ship wasn't enough to cover what was owed. Spain wasn't paying down its debt, it was drowning in it. Philip eventually did what no monarch had ever done so openly. He declared bankruptcy. He simply told the most powerful bankers in Europe that he wasn't paying. Banks collapsed in Antwerp and Genoa overnight. Credit markets across the continent froze solid. It was the 16th century's version of a global financial crisis triggered by a single king's decision. But it changed nothing about the spending. Spain defaulted again in 1575, again in 1596, again and again across the next century. Borrow, spend, collapse. Borrow, spend, collapse. When the king couldn't pay his soldiers, they mutinied and sacked the city of Antwerp, their own city, burning one of Europe's greatest financial centers to ash. When the silver mines of Potosi finally began to run dry, Spain had nothing left to stand on. No manufacturing sector, no innovative merchant class, no agricultural productivity. The cities emptied, populations fell, fields went unplanted. The empire that had once owned the world became known humiliatingly as the sick man of Europe. Spain was the pipe through which the treasure of the Americas flowed to build the modern world. And when the flow stopped, Spain was left with nothing but empty mines and broken institutions.
The lesson here cuts deeper than history. It applies to every nation sitting on oil wealth today, every individual who comes into sudden fortune, every society tempted to consume rather than create. Easy money breaks the fundamental connection between effort and reward. It feels like freedom, but it is a slow, invisible cage. Spain thought it was the master of its destiny. In reality, it had become a slave to its own fortune.
If this story made you think differently about wealth, power, and what it actually means to be prosperous, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we dig into the economic stories and historical turning points that still shape the world you live in today. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.